very briefly, in 2008, you had the big financial crisis. And then for a few months, the G20, well, all the politicians said never again, blah, blah, blah. And then they met with the G20 in Pittsburgh in late 2009. And that's where they decided on their agenda, actually not to change the financial system, but they called it post-crisis financial regulation. That, if you like, in a certain way, that's where the ambition was killed. They all agreed that instead of looking at the fundamental issues, so what happened over the last 25 years, so deregulation, financialization, and I could go on, that is what led to the crisis. For most people in the street, I think that was obvious. Even people who are not literate in these subjects, that the crisis was only the symptom or the result of fundamental things that had been going on for 20 or 30 years. Globalization, but a certain type of globalization. The G20 said, no, we're not going to discuss any of that. What we're going to do is make sure that when the next crisis hits, because crisis happens, it's like tsunamis, I'll come back to that. Well, we need to make sure that that time the citizens or the taxpayers do not get hurt. And as I always say, as I often say, the only way to avoid a tsunami to hit coastal villages, if the coastal villages are the citizens and the tsunami are banking losses, that's what happened with the crisis, the only way to avoid that the tsunami hits the coastal village is to avoid the tsunami to happen. Anyone who's heard about what a tsunami is knows building embankments does not help. For big waves, yes, not for a tsunami. But so that was the ambition of the G20, is to build embankments to make sure that when the next tsunami comes, and so it's capital requirements, it's making sure the debtors of the bank take the hits, etc. But of course, that didn't work for any reason. So to keep it short, we were created then in 2011, so 2 years later, because the ambition, or the lack of ambition, if you like, of the G20 started to be translated into mainly Brussels and Washington into legislation. So legislation to re-regulate finance. And so people like Sven Giegold and members of the European Parliament realized, but again, that they should have realized, not people like Sven, but they realized there were no counterweight. So on one specific piece of legislation, indeed, they would have 100 meetings, and maybe 1 or 2 meetings were with people outside of the financial sector. So the financial sector is diverse. There are hedge funds, bankers, markets, and then maybe there were, I don't know, Oxfam or one union who would have one very specific angle, but probably not the level of technical details to really weigh in. So Finance Watch was created, and for 4 or 5 years the idea was, let's use the maximum of this momentum for regulation from a public interest point of view. And we failed, that's okay. I mean, you all know we failed. You said it, the financial system did not change. I think you were even a bit too positive, saying maybe we have a bit less of this and that. Maybe, but maybe it's not even because of regulation, it's just because of market trends. And so it didn't really change, and that's okay, because I think we needed to build this counterweight. We need some people, from citizens, from the public interest, to understand financial regulation in detail, and so we continue to do that. But so what I want to focus on now, for 2 minutes before I finish, is that after 5 or 6 years of doing that, we took a step back and thought, okay, this is not working. So if you have an agenda that has been defined and is not ambitious enough, then making the most of that agenda, again, is not enough. And anyway, we are not strong enough to play that counterweight. So Finance Watch from the beginning was a membership organization, but we invested less in developing that membership and more in the technical stuff. Again, I think that was necessary. But so what we call now the second phase of our existence, or Finance Watch 2.0, if you want to call it, is investing much more in building that membership, building a coalition of actors, and it's NGOs, it's citizens. It is crucially what we call the pioneering practitioners. Let's call them the pioneers, which are people like Christian or like Newbie, doing things differently already. Showing it's not a dream. You can actually do it differently. So NGOs, citizens, practitioners. But academia as well, because we know from experience there are a lot of people very expert and very supportive, but they are fragmented. They are all over the place, and so we don't have this sort of we do not manage to have enough power to weight in the balance because we are not united. So the idea is to use the 10th anniversary of the crisis. On 15 September this year, this will be the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman, which was a bit symbolic as the peak of the collapse of the financial system. To launch a campaign to change finance. We've done that in the past, campaigns to change finance, but hopefully this time we managed to get the momentum, but also to get the broad coalition to make it work, and this time to really set the agenda on our own terms. And I think just to finish, I'd like to relate also to what's happening, other things that are happening in the world, the discontent we see from citizens to politicians. So, stuff like Trump, stuff like Brexit, I think shows that citizens will not take it anymore. I mean, I think there is something very positive underlying beneath that, which is that citizens, they just want change. They will not take the status quo anymore. And I would argue when I was a bit younger and creating Attack in Brussels, and I was idealist, but I'm still very idealist. But I think actually the potential for real radical change was much lower then. It's much, much bigger now. I mean, the crisis has deepened, so in a way it's more depressing because the stakes are much higher. We are much closer to some sort of collapse. But at the same time, the potential for change and the support for people for radical change has never been bigger. I think, unfortunately, it's the wrong kind of people who now step out and say, well, I promise you radical change, me, Donald Trump, of all people, or Nigel Farage. But I think it shows that that's what we need to do as well in our camp, on our side. And I do think focusing on finance and more specifically the financialization of the economy. So it's not just about regulating banks, it's about undoing 25 years of financialization. I think this sort of campaign can actually help to support a shift of paradigm, which is much more fundamental, which is what we need if we need to avoid collapse. So this is what we'll be focusing on, and you will certainly hear from us about this campaign in the coming weeks. Thank you.